Hi everyone, I'm Hanovi Schoonover, the Training and Resource Coordinator for Redwind Consulting, and I'll be the Redwind host for this webinar. Today we'll be going over a survivor-centered approach to mandatory reporting in Indian country. Joining us today is our presenter, Alicia Aiken. Alicia has been the director of the Confidentiality Institute since 2011, a national organization empowering people to protect privacy for crime victims. As of 2019, Ms. Aiken is also a principal consultant with the Danu Center for Strategic Advocacy, which supports social justice advocates and mission-based organizations to translate their values into effective action. Previously, Ms. Aiken spent 15 years as a legal service attorney with LAF in Chicago, where she represented individuals in a variety of complex legal matters. She has received both her undergraduate and law degrees from the University of Michigan, and I will now turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Hanovi. Hi, everyone. So this is Alicia Aiken, and I'm looking forward to having what, as much as possible, can be a conversation about the issue of mandatory reporting in Indian country. We're going to focus primarily on thinking about mandatory reporting around child abuse and child maltreatment, but the principles are the same for how you think about mandatory reporting for elder abuse, or for vulnerable adults, or for, frankly, if you think that there's a duty to warn out there, or any other law that says you are required to make some kind of a report about what's happening to someone else, even though you are a confidential professional. So with that, why don't we dive in? Basically, what I want to give you today is a mandatory reporting plan. I think that for a lot of people, if you do this work, if you work on anti-violence issues, you know that it's going to come up, or it already has come up for you many times, and people aren't always sure what they should do. It's kind of like you hope it doesn't happen, then it does happen, you kind of act quickly and instinctually, and then maybe you're satisfied or dissatisfied with the experience, and then you try to forget about it until it comes up again. What I'd like for people to be able to do is to have an approach where when it comes up, they at least feel like there's a step-by-step plan, although I'm going to be really honest, a lot of the plan involves doing work in advance. It involves being really deeply connected in your community, knowing what's happening, what are other offices, organizations, agencies doing in response to the abuse that you might be reporting, so that you can prepare for yourself and help prepare survivors. So a relatively small part of this is, what do you do the day you hear about the thing that you think you have to report? So we're going to work on a 5-step approach to survivor-centered mandatory reporting. And as we talk about, we're going to talk a little bit about the interplay between personal privacy, cultural norms, and federal rules for tribal advocates. But I want to emphasize, I am not going to be able to tell those of you on the webinar precisely what your personal mandatory reporting duty is. It's different, and we'll talk about what I mean by that in a moment. A big point of today's webinar is to identify the questions that you don't know the answers to right now, so that you and your tribal government or your social services office can do the work of trying to answer the question so that you're ready in the future. So if things come up today and you think to yourself, I don't know, that's great. That's actually good news, because the most important thing we can do is identify that stuff so that we can move forward and go find answers. So at the end of the day, on some level, we know that when a mandatory report will come up is unexpected, but we know it's going to happen. So to that end, we're going to pack a bag. And we're going to keep this bag packed for a safe trip, right? We're always often talking to survivors about having a bag packed in case they have to take action quickly without a lot of preparation time. And I think mandatory reporting is a similar situation. Have a bag kind of packed in advance so that you're ready to take action. So what are the 5 steps? The 5 steps to a good mandatory reporting plan are first, to learn your rules. Second, to alert survivors about what the rules are. The third is to know Child Protective Services views, and whatever acronym you use, right? Some folks will say ICWA, some say CPS, some say child welfare. It's all kinds of different shorthand phrases, but we know what we mean by that is the agencies or the professionals that are investigating and responding to charges of abuse against children. We want to know how they are thinking about what they're doing and how they're approaching it. The fourth part of the plan is to prepare to talk to Child Protective Services, CPS, or the ICWA person, to know how you're going to prepare yourself to actually do that communicating. And then the fifth step is what you're doing all the time in your work, which is empowering survivors to manage this situation and to not feel just completely powerless and buffeted around by it. So let's break this down and take each of the steps kind of one at a time. So the first step is, before you start talking to survivors, or if you've already started them because you're already doing this work, before you go forward, you need to know what you are required to do. What are the things that you have to do, and what are the things that you are forbidden from doing? So if you are a federally funded advocate, so lots of tribes have a domestic violence advocate because they're getting money under the Violence Against Women Act. If you're getting money under the Violence Against Women Act, it requires all the victim services grantees to protect the confidentiality and privacy of persons receiving or seeking services. So what does that really mean when we say protect confidentiality and privacy? I always think it's important to distinguish that privacy it's a personal right. It's something that belongs to individuals, and it's individuals deciding who knows what about them, deciding how to control their reputation out in the world. Confidentiality is the thing that professionals offer to people. Confidentiality is when you say to somebody, if you share information with me in order to get help from me, I promise that you're still going to have control over that information, that I'm only going to share it when you want me to share it, that I'm going to let you drive the bus on deciding on where it goes and what happens to it. What's important about that in today's webinar is that mandatory reporting is an example of when the survivor does not have privacy, when you as a professional cannot say to them, I promise you I would never tell this to anyone. Because if you have a mandatory reporting duty, you might have to say to them, in this instance, in this circumstance, if I learn this kind of information, here's the thing that I have to do. And so it's important to be really clear that that is an exception to confidentiality. But thinking about what is the federal rule, it's essentially a no disclosure rule. It says that grantees shall not disclose, reveal, or release any personally identifying information or individual information that's collected in connection with services. I have given you in that files box the document that's called VAWA FIPSA, October 2017. That is the language both from the Violence Against Women Act and from the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, which some of you might be getting funding under, but also you might not. But they're essentially the same rule. I want you to have the language of the actual law because it's important that you shouldn't do this because I said so on a webinar, right? You're going to do this because this is in fact the rule, and you always want to be able to read the rule for yourself and to be able to show the rule to other people if they doubt you that that's the rule. So please feel free to hand out that handout to anyone you like to say, this is the rule. And if they look at it and they say, well, this comes from some lady in Chicago at the Confidentiality Institute, what does she know? That handout actually has the citations in it so anybody can look it up to see what the actual federal law is. It's actually, and this is a super dorky lawyer thing to say, but it's an exciting time to be alive in a world of rules because of the internet. Anybody can look up the laws that might apply as long as you've got internet access, you can look them up, and that just didn't used to be true. It used to be I literally, as a lawyer, would have to drive an hour and a half to go to a law library when I practiced in rural Vermont in order to look up rules. So it's very exciting to me to be able to pass rules out to people. The third document in the files box, the name of it is very boring, 28 CFR 90.1 to 90.64. That is the regulation, the rule about how people are supposed to implement the VAWA privacy rule. And that's actually really important if you're working in a tribal community, because there's been a lot of discussion and some conflict over the years about if you are an advocate and your tribe is the grantee that has received Violence Against Women Act money. Often what will happen is that everyone who works for tribal government will say to the advocate, you can tell me anything I want to know about a domestic violence survivor because VAWA says that the grantee shouldn't disclose information, and since we are the grantee, we're allowed to know anything you know. That actually was not the intention of the law. It's not how it works. And so in 2016, they wrote a regulation to clarify it, and what it says is that the Victim Services Unit, whoever is providing victim services, that is who is allowed to have access to and know the information about the survivor, and if you share it with anyone else, that's a violation. Now, I know that's a really tough rule for a lot of tribal grantees because there might be one person who's working on domestic violence victim services, and you might feel very alone. If anybody on this webinar is in that situation and you're struggling with figuring out how to manage information, how to do your job well, how to be supervised well, please reach out for technical assistance, because we're Confidentiality Institute, in partnership with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, is here to try to help programs figure out how to implement VAWA confidentiality well. So we don't want anybody feeling stranded and alone or feeling like they have to violate privacy just in order to function within your community. And at the end of this webinar, on the last slide, or the next to last slide, there is an email address for me, and you can contact me anytime you like to ask a technical assistance question. So to sum up, what VAWA is essentially saying is that if you share information outside of your program, your victim services unit, whoever's in there, is who the survivor chose to share information with. If you share information outside of that, it counts as a disclosure. And VAWA says you cannot make a disclosure unless the survivor says they want you to. And then there's a couple of other exceptions, frankly, when the law makes you share information. Now, people often ask me when I talk about this idea of a circle in the victim services unit, they'll say, well, how do I know who's inside of it? What I always say is everybody inside of that circle is following the same rules about information. You're following the same protective measures about when you wouldn't share or when you would share, or how you would use information or how you wouldn't use it. So for instance, if your supervisor is also the ICWA person and they would use any information they receive to facilitate a child abuse investigation, that's not following the same rules as what a victim advocate follows. So they shouldn't be in the victim services unit. Again, I know from doing technical assistance over the last 8 years that there are folks who are in that situation, and I don't want to cause anybody sort of a feeling of panic or crisis. If you're in a situation that you think might be problematic around confidentiality and you want help working that out, please reach out for technical assistance. And the other thing I didn't say, there's a couple of times when I'm going to ask you to chat in your thoughts, but you can chat in a question that you have or a thought that you're having anytime you like during this session. There's a chat box. It does go to everyone, so just be aware of that. But I'll be able to see it, and I like getting questions while I'm presenting because it makes me feel like I'm not so deeply alone in my office staring at a computer while I'm talking for a long period of time. So please feel free to send in questions or thoughts or pushback. If there's something that I'm saying that you're like, I don't think that's right, or I don't agree, or I want to hear more, by all means, put that out there. The bottom line of how to think about the Violence Against Women Act federal confidentiality rule is that it's trying to say that the survivor decides who gets to know what, when information gets shared. If you're getting VAWA funding and you're getting individual survivor information, the survivor decides who knows what. Personally identifying information belongs to the survivor, is controlled by them, and is disclosed by them. Sometimes it might be you disclosing it because they gave you an instruction to do it, but it's them that's disclosing it. So here's a point where I'd love to have folks chat in their thoughts, because in the work that I've done with various tribal communities, it struck me that there's a little bit of a mismatch here, where privacy and confidentiality is very much about the individual person working alone and making decisions on their own about what should happen. And I'm curious what your thoughts are about how that fits with your tribal values of community and kinship and group problem solving. Does it fit well? Does it fit uncomfortably? Does anybody have thoughts about that? If your thought is that's a stupid, dumb question, you can send that in too. Otherwise, it's just me alone talking to a wall. All right, I'm going to move on, I guess. I hope I'm going to ask a better question that's going to get your typing fingers loosened up. I really would like to make this somewhat interactive, because otherwise talking about the law can just be deadly boring. All right, so I said that the VAWA rule is that survivors decide what happens to information, but there is an exception in VAWA where you as the advocate can share personally identifying information if you are mandated to do so by a statute or by a court order. So essentially what it's saying is, look, if there's some government decision that comes through a statute or comes through a court order, then you may be required to share information, even if the survivor doesn't want you to, didn't have any part in it. And you can disclose that, and you will not be in trouble with the grant. You won't be in violation of federal law. And it is actually in that situation irrelevant whether the survivor wants you to or doesn't want you to. Now, we're going to talk about best practices for being survivor-centered and supporting the survivor through that experience and finding out what they care about. But in terms of whether you're going to share the information or not, if you're mandated to do it, you're going to have to do it even if they don't like it. Now, what VAWA does say you're required to do is that if you're in a situation where the law, for instance, a mandatory report, you must make it. The federal law does say that you're supposed to make reasonable attempts to provide notice to someone who's affected by the disclosure. And this can be a little bit at odds. A lot of state laws about mandatory reporting say that the mandatory reporter identity cannot be shared by the state. You call in a report to a hotline, and the mandatory reporter's identity will not be shared by the state hotline. That's great. But if you're doing VAWA-funded advocacy, you're in a different role. You're in a role where you are working for the survivor all the time. So if you're going to have to make a report and it's going to impact them, VAWA does actually say that you need to take reasonable attempts to give them notice and take necessary steps to protect privacy and safety. Now, emphasis on reasonable attempts. If notifying somebody that you're going to make this mandatory report will actually cause physical danger or harm, then it would be unreasonable to make that, to give that notice. Does that make sense? Like what the federal law is asking you to do is make reasonable attempts to give notice. But if you conclude that it would be unreasonable or dangerous to anyone, then that would be a situation where you would not give notice to the survivor. All right, so we're already 20 minutes into the webinar, and I've been using this term mandatory reporter or mandatory reporting a lot. And those of you on the call, there's a good chance that you are a mandatory reporter under state, federal, or tribal law. But can you tell me, what does it mean to be a mandatory reporter? What does that actually mean for you? Okay, so Autumn chatted in that to be a mandatory reporter is to means required to report child abuse, and that may well be true, right? And I like the way that you focused on required. You know, what being a mandatory reporter really means is that there is some kind of a law that covers you, that requires you to do something specific, and it is usually around child abuse or around elder abuse or vulnerable adult abuse. So how do you know what your mandatory reporting duty is? You've got to go and hopefully in collaboration with your boss, with your agency, with your office, with your community, and determine exactly what laws apply to you and what do they require that you do. You can't just assume. A lot of people will just assume because they're an advocate or because they have a social work degree or because they used to be a mandatory reporter when they worked somewhere else, that they'll just make an assumption that they are. I can tell you that 8 years of looking at mandatory reporting laws all across the United States, they're very different from each other. There is no one rule. Again, the way that I was just able to say to you, the Violence Against Women Act, if you get that funding, it has this one rule about information. I cannot say to you that there is one national rule about mandatory reporting. It is different everywhere. And that's going to be frustrating. I'm going to just say that right up front, potentially complicated for those of you that are working in communities where you may be functioning under tribal law and state law or two states laws, and because you're in a tribal community, you're also going to need to look at federal law, but it's just not the kind of question that I can answer on a national basis. It's really the kind of question that has to be answered locally, although in collaboration with a local lawyer, I can help folks figure it out and unravel it. Like I can't be your lawyer wherever you are, but I can be a technical assistance to a local lawyer because these are particular kinds of laws, and sometimes it's hard to know what you're looking for, and because I've looked at them all over the country, I have a sense of what to look for. But you are going to have to do some work. Some states have a law that says every single person is a mandatory reporter. Some states will say if you are working in this particular profession, you are a mandatory reporter, and I will tell you there are several places where being a domestic violence advocate is not on the list of professions that are covered, and it's important to be aware of that. And it's important to know kind of what kind of work you are actually doing. It might be that you have a bachelor's in social work, but you are not necessarily practicing social work in the work that you're currently doing. So there are, in terms of figuring out what is your mandatory reporting duty, it's important to pay attention both to where you are and what laws apply to where you are, what that law says about either individual people or particular professions, and knowing what profession you're practicing. And that, again, should be something that you're not, an individual advocate should not be doing that alone. That's something that even if you are the only domestic violence advocate, your tribal council, your tribal government should be helping you to sort that out. If you may have a tribal attorney who can help you with that, and I can give technical assistance to those folks. Sometimes people sit on multidisciplinary teams. Is there anybody on the webinar right now who participates in a multidisciplinary team? You can raise your hand. If you go to the top of the screen, there's a little person there with their hand up in the air, and if you click that button, you can raise your hand. Okay, so at least one, or you can chat it. Thank you, Heather. So if you sit on a multidisciplinary team, a lot of times folks make an assumption that because they're on the multidisciplinary team, they're required to share information with the team, or they'll say, well, I'm a mandatory reporter, so when I go to the multidisciplinary team, I have to share information. That is not necessarily true. In fact, I have yet to see a place where that is true. So being on a multidisciplinary team, usually what the law just says is you're on the team. You're there because of your expertise and your professional knowledge. You're not there necessarily to carry information about individual survivors or individual families or children. Even if you were, being a mandatory reporter is an entirely different thing. It generally means there's a set of rules about when you have to call a hotline and make a report. Sharing information at an MDT meeting is not calling a hotline or making a report. So it's important, I put this slide in here because it's important to separate those two things from each other. They are different. If somebody says to you, well, of course you can share everything you know about that family with us because you're on the MDT, it's an important opportunity to say, well, I have a rule under federal law that says I'm not allowed to share information. Can you show me the rule, the statute that says that I have to share being on an MDT? And don't let people just say to you, oh, there is one. Say, great, can I look at it? And again, we live in the age of the internet. Anybody is capable of getting internet access, looking it up, and sending you a rule so that we can all look at what it is. So besides the question of what am I required to do, am I actually a mandatory reporter? If you determine that you are, there's a second level of questions to be determined, which is trying to get an understanding of what kind of information actually has to be reported. And this is another thing that is very different from place to place. So you may have a law that says you have to report neglect of children, right? And that neglect might include failing to protect them in their environment. Well, if a child witnesses a parent experiencing domestic violence, if a child is at home or in the room when one parent is hurting another parent, or when a partner is hurting their parent, is that child abuse? And I ask that question that way because the answer is different kind of everywhere. And I'm really sorry. I wish I could give a clearer, one national answer. But different states, different jurisdictions have made very different decisions about when a child being present in the room while a parent is being hurt raises to the level of something that is child abuse or that needs to be reported. And really pay attention to the difference. There is a difference between this is something that impacts children and can have a harmful effect, and they need help and they need support, and they are also survivors. All of those things can be true, and it still might not be mandatory reportable child abuse under that law. It's, at the end of the day, it's not a gut feeling. It should be a matter of law, but unfortunately the laws are not as clear in all places as I would like them to be. But we can help find the experts who can help you try to understand what the rules are where you are. The second thing that comes up is teen dating violence. Some mandatory reporting statutes are written in such a way that only violence by adults against children is something that has to be reported. And other places say any violence against a child by anyone must be reported. And that's going to vary. I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, the state of, it's either Colorado or Nevada, I apologize. Actually, the Attorney General has said, no, if a 5-year-old hits a 5-year-old on the playground, that actually has to be reported to the child abuse hotline. So this comes up with teen dating violence. If there is a teenager under 18 who's experiencing dating violence with another teenager under the age of 18, it's going to be kind of specific to your local law. And, this is a big issue because a lot of teenagers, if they think this is going to trigger a report to child welfare and an investigation that involves their parents, they may not come for help. They may say, I don't trust you to help me because you are going to tell someone what happened to me. So if it is not a reportable event, it can be very useful to let teenagers know that so that they feel safe coming for and getting help and then figuring out how to access what they need, with your support. The third question that comes up that can be a complicated area is minors having sex. The big question, most everywhere that has mandatory reporting says that if a minor is sexually assaulted, that's a reportable event, no matter who did the assault. But when minors are having consensual sex, it can become a question of, does the law recognize this as something that's consensual sex? So these are three areas that are going to be very different in different places. And again, you don't want to try to do it on a gut feeling. With the help of your agency, with the help of your tribe, you should get this worked out in advance, because the laws are there, they exist, and there are lawyers in the jurisdiction who should be able to help sort it out. Again, if you're thinking to yourself, I have no idea what the answer to these questions are, that is okay. That was literally one of the goals of today's webinars, is to shine a light on things that it would be useful to know, but you don't, and then give you this PowerPoint so you can take it back to your community and say, hey, these are some questions that I think we need to work on getting answered so that we don't wonder what they are. So that was step number one. I will tell you that's the longest step, so don't worry that this is going to go on forever. Step number one involves the most discussion and explanation, but we're going to pack it away in our bag. Before we start moving to step number two, I wanted to ask a question of folks, because I think sometimes when we talk about mandatory reporting, it begins to feel like mandatory reporting to a hotline is the only way to respond to child maltreatment. And I know that's not true, and I know you know that's not true, because you do a whole lot of work around keeping children and families safe, separate from mandatory reports. So I just want us to center ourselves for a minute. What are other strategies that you can use as a professional or as a community member to respond when children are being harmed, completely separate from making a child abuse hotline report? What are other ways that you feel like you can respond and help to help children and families to find safety? I'm going to wait. I know somebody out there has a thought or a good idea. What are the things that you already do or that you can do? So Autumn offered that when you're not sure if you should make a mandatory report, that you might, sometimes folks will try using hypotheticals without disclosing personal information. So that's, and that can, if you really are able to make it actually not identifying, which if you're in a small community and your office is next door to CPS and CPS can see who's coming into your office, it can be pretty hard to actually, keep it non-identifying. But I understand that sometimes that's a useful technique. But just totally aside from engaging the mandatory reporting CPS system, just pretend CPS doesn't exist. What are the things that you as advocates are able to do to help when you think that there might be a child being harmed in a family? With the skills that you have, the resources that you have, see, Autumn is typing, which is great. Everyone else is letting Autumn do the work. Because what I'm asking us to do is to expand our imaginations about the variety of ways that we can help. Right, so Autumn said we safety plan with victims, we discuss options of relocation away from the abuser, we talk to them about what they want for the next step, what do they think safety could look like, how do we expand a survivor's imagination about what is possible and how they can sort of change the environment. Because that's, sometimes I feel like the irony of the reliance of the mandatory reporting system is that the idea of mandatory reporting is that there are children who are families that are not getting help to deal with violence, and so we have to report them. But what happens when they get reported? They get referred back to you, right? So if a family's already with you, they're already getting help. So I want us to emphasize in our own minds all the things that we do, all the important roles that you play as an advocate in supporting families and helping families that are different from just calling a hotline. Calling a hotline doesn't actually solve anything. And I emphasize this because sometimes folks are nervous if they go back and they look at their laws and they discover something isn't reportable, they feel stuck or powerless. I don't want you to feel stuck or powerless because you're not. You are, as advocates, the most empowered and empowering kind of professionals out there because you're all about creative solutions and problem solving and imagination and knowing what's possible. And we want to bring all those same skills to how do we respond to a concern that a child is in harm's way. Okay, so we're on to step number 2, where you want to think about what do we say before a survivor discloses to you. In other words, you've now figured out what your rules are. You have a clear sense of what are your boundaries. When can you honestly say to somebody, if you tell me, I'm not going to tell anybody else. What you need to do before you start talking to a survivor is make sure that they know what your rules are. So if you say to somebody, I know, if you talk to me, I'm not going to tell anybody else. You can trust me. This is safe. That's great. But if there's an exception, you have to tell them what the exception is. And the big exception is often mandatory reporting of child abuse. You want to have a standard and comfortable way of explaining it to survivors that is both honest but not so scary that it makes them feel like you don't want to talk to them, right? So, when you and I talk, everything stays between you and me and the other people working in my office, and I'm not going to share it with anyone else unless you ask me to. There is an exception to that. If I learn that your kids have been hurt or are being hurt, and they have to report that to a hotline. If that comes up, we'll talk about it, right? So it's telling people what's going to happen so that they know before they start talking. Now, one of the things about the pattern, the disclosure that I just gave you, is that if it's complicated in your area, whether witnessing domestic violence counts, it's going to be complicated to warn people about that. And that's something when you figure out what your rule is, you have to figure out what is a comfortable appropriate, honest way to alert people, because I think most people know about mandatory reporting of child abuse, but most people have a perception that what you're saying to them is, if I tell you I hit my kid, you're going to have to call it in. Some people understand that you're also saying, if I tell you my husband hit my kids, you'll have to call it in. Almost no one, almost nobody is going to think that if they say to you, my kids saw it when my husband hit me, almost no one will think that that's something that has to be called in, and so we have to help educate survivors about what the rules really are. And again, you can't educate them unless you've educated yourself, so that's why step number 1 is so important. So it's making sure that survivors know what counts as reportable abuse, and then really just creating an expectation in your agency, in your office, between you and your supervisor, that you are expected to use that every time. And that includes if you're ever out doing presentations in the community, if you are ever saying to folks in a space, this is a confidential space, what happens here stays here, or even if you're not saying that, if you're going to be giving a presentation that might cause people to make a disclosure to you, to come up to you after a session, you want to do them a favor and kind of let them know what the parameters of that are. And I know it can feel clunky. I actually deal with it all the time because I am a lawyer who gives people technical assistance. So people will call me thinking, oh, I'm calling a lawyer. So when I talk to a lawyer, everything I say is private. I speak freely. And I always have to say to people at the beginning of the technical assistance, when you and I talk, I'm not being your lawyer. And because I'm not your lawyer, I don't have privilege. So that means somebody could force me to share it. I won't volunteer the information, but I want to make sure you're aware someone could force me to share it if they ever wanted to. I do that every day. And I just kind of had to work out what sentences I was comfortable saying, what they would sound like coming out of my mouth, and then I have to remind myself to always be sure that I say them. And sometimes it means I'll pick up the phone and someone will just start talking and telling me a story, and I have to gently interrupt them and say, before we get going, just want to make sure that you know what the kind of the rules are when you and I talk. People appreciate it. They appreciate being dealt with clearly and honestly. And then the other thing is if you have colleagues, new colleagues who are coming in the door, there's really 2 ways that people learn how to do their job. They learn how to do their job from their bosses and the policies and the procedures, and they learn how to do their job from their colleagues, right? What's the culture in the place where you are? What is the person who's been there 6 months longer than you have say to you, oh yeah, here's what you're really supposed to do? Like, are you building a culture within your work and everyone who's doing the work of handling this in a consistent manner? Everybody, no matter how new you are, has the power to create organizational culture. All right, so we learned our rules, we packed that, we're going to alert the survivor and pack that. The third step in the plan is investigating CPS attitudes. It's kind of a broad way of saying try as much as possible to learn about how things are happening in your community in the same way that I think as an advocate you develop sort of an understanding of how police officers respond. You may, depending on how long you've been working in your community, you may really know everybody who is involved in police response, and you could say to a survivor, I know who's on duty right now, and I know how they would react to this, or I have a sense, I have experience with how they would react to this. As a lawyer, I spent 15 years representing survivors, so when we got assigned to a judge, and that was in Chicago, so there were a lot of judges to choose from, but we would get assigned to a judge, and I usually could say to a client, I don't know for sure what this judge will do, but I know this judge is very gruff with everybody. Doesn't have anything to do with your case, it's just the personality. Or this judge is very gentle and very nice to everybody, but that also doesn't mean we're going to win. Right? And so I could sort of prepare people for what they could expect. So same thing. If survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault are going to be dealing with Child Protective Services, they're going to be dealing with the ICWA office a lot. It'll be very common because we know it is so common that folks who are domestic violence survivors have children with their abusers, and it's so common that sexual assault survivors are in fact children. So we know they're going to be dealing with CPS. We want to really get to understand CPS attitudes. Heather sits on an MDT, and MDT is a terrific place to get to know how CPS thinks about the work they're doing, and to ask questions and have them answer them and ask them to show you their rules to the extent they have any. The questions that you're really looking at is, how is your community investigating and prosecuting child abuse? How much is it treated? What kinds of cases get treated as something that's like a social services intervention, and what cases get treated as this is a criminal issue and we're going to prosecute somebody? Who are the survivor-centered allies working in CPS and ICWA? Who are the people who maybe originally were a domestic violence advocate and then moved to the CPS work? Who really is thinking about the complexities of responding to child abuse when you have a non-offending parent who may also be a victim of violence, and that's going to have traumatic impacts on them, and how do we treat them? Like, you've got allies. There are phenomenal people working in this field, people who care very deeply about children and families and peaceful, safe communities. Find them, get to know them, talk with them, learn from them. Does the local CPS or ICWA have any specific protocols for responding to domestic violence? Are there rules that tell them how to think about it, how to assess it, how to react to it? I'm in the state of Illinois. We've undergone a huge change in the last 15 years in the state of Illinois on how the agency thinks about and responds to domestic violence, and that's the direct work of domestic violence specialist attorneys and advocates really sort of working with CPS and saying, you want safe, stable families, and blaming domestic violence victims for their children being harmed doesn't get you safe, stable families. It gets kids double disconnected from caregivers. So what can we do together to try to bolster the non-offending victim parent while still pursuing safety and accountability for the violent parent? You definitely want to know how CPS is addressing implicit bias and attending to culture. We know there is a long, unfortunate, some would say ugly history with government, child protective services taking children away from their families, supposedly for the good of the children or for the good of the broader community. And I am not accusing anyone of doing that today, but there are real implicit biases that are built into the child welfare system that good people working in the system can address and minimize or even eliminate, but they have to be consciously doing the work. And you want to be able to know, are they consciously doing the work? And because part of that is you being able to say to a survivor who might have to engage with that system, here is the work that I know they're doing. Here is the language that we can use when we talk to them about to ensure that you're being treated fairly and respected for who you are and where you come from. It's really important to have an understanding of how the survivor parent might get treated. So, and for some folks, when we think about mandatory reporting, especially in the instance if we say that for instance, a father is physically assaulting a mother or even assaulting the kids, we're going to call. You need to know how your local CPS or your ICWA investigator, how do they think about the role of the non-offending parent or the survivor parent. Some states, and Illinois used to be one of them, part of the reason we had a change in the law is because what we had was so very bad, will actively blame and punish the mother who was being assaulted for not leaving soon enough. So what is the possible risk of a finding of abuse and neglect against the survivor parent? Is it possible that the children might be removed Or is it possible that the children will get to stay with the nonviolent parent, but that the nonviolent parent will be listed as neglectful on a state registry? And this is something a lot of people don't know about. It's a pretty important thing to know about. Every state has a registry of, quote, child abusers. And I think a lot of people assume that everybody on that list is somebody who has been convicted of child abuse or had their children taken away. And in fact, it's not true at all. The list can be much broader than that. It can be that there was an investigation and that a child welfare social worker found that, that they think that it's reasonably likely that somebody committed neglect of their children, and so they put them on this registry list. People can be on the list for 5, 10, 15, 50 years. It depends on both what they're accused of and what state they're in. If you're on that list, you can't work in social work or nursing homes or childcare or schools. You often can't participate in your kids' school if they're going to a public school. You might be barred from doing a lot of very important community things if you are on that list. So when we're thinking about consequences to survivor parents of engagement with child welfare, we want to pay attention to that registry issue. We know lots of people, if they're experiencing violence situations, might also use drugs or alcohol, either to self-medicate or because their partner purposely got them hooked as a way to sort of control them. We want to be aware of how does CPS in your area respond to that. Are they open to hearing that some people are using drugs and alcohol as a direct result of the abuse and that what they really need is support to get sober and to get clean, but not to be punished as criminals? Is there a criminal history? We know a lot of people are coerced into criminal activity, or they engage in criminal activity to try to take care of themselves or protect themselves or their children when they're being harmed by someone else. Just really knowing these things. And this is having a conversation with people who work in CPS or who work in ICWA separate from an individual case. Right? This isn't calling and saying, I'm making a mandatory report about this family. Now I want to know how you're going to react to all these negative things in this family's past. This is what I'm really saying is think about all these elements and get to know people, get to know what their rules are, get to know what their reactions are, in part because then if an individual case does come up, you're going to have an easier time having a conversation with them about what is going on with a family. It's possible that a survivor might say to you as an advocate, I want you to tell them some of the things that I have going on that may be seen as negative, because I think if we share them and we're upfront about them, we can have a better conversation and it will be less bad. And it is important, even if you're not a mandatory reporter, if you look at your rules and conclude that you would not be making a report, survivors of violence are still going to be interacting with people who are mandatory reporters all the time. So it's still very important that you understand how these systems work so that you can support people to navigate them. There is absolutely in many, many jurisdictions the risk that the child welfare will treat the survivor parent as a neglectful parent for being assaulted in front of their child and not leaving soon enough. There is a relatively recent case out of California in 2014 where a court of appeals found that the mother failed to protect the children after she had already left the father and filed for divorce. And they said, and the first time it came to the court's attention was after she had left him and after she had filed for divorce, and they said that she was a neglectful parent because she didn't do it sooner. So that's a real risk. All right. So remember when I said that most of the work on this is before you ever have an actual mandatory reporting issue in front of you? I just want to reiterate that. Like, this is preparing and doing some homework. You know, the learning your rules is something that hopefully only really has to be done once, and then if there's a change in the law, someone will let you know and you'll be prepared for it. Investigating CPS attitudes is really a question of developing relationships and maintaining those relationships so that you understand. And it's listening fully to people, understanding where they're coming from. It's not saying to them, you're wrong or that's not survivor-centered. It's really listening to where they're coming from so that you can help them see where the goals that you have and the goals that they have actually align. Anytime we're talking about trying to have safe, stable families, so the goals of domestic violence advocacy, sexual assault advocacy, and child welfare all come together. We have to remember to talk about it in those terms. Okay, so we've packed the investigating CPS views. Now the next question is really having an understanding in advance. What are you going to do if you do have to make a report? How are you going to handle communicating? Right? So you're going to prepare for how you would tell child welfare information and how much you would tell them. And these are the two important questions. So if you are a mandated reporter and you have a thing that you have to tell, you want to know how do you have to report. First of all, when do you have to do it? A lot of statutes will say immediately, but then they don't define what immediately means. And again, remember that VAWA requires that you give survivors reasonable notice that this is happening, right? So that would be like immediately would be after taking that step to give reasonable notice. Then the question is sort of how do you make that report? A lot of places require both a report to a phone call, to a hotline, and then often a follow-up by filling out a form. So you just kind of want to know what that form looks like in advance. Know what is the hotline that you actually have to call. But remember that it's not your role to investigate. So it is not an advocate who learns information. You are not under some duty to go get more. One way to, I talked about teenagers being very nervous about sharing what's happened to them because they're afraid they're going to get reported and then it'll make things worse rather than better. There is a runaway youth program out of one state that says to teenagers, we are mandatory reporters. We do actually have to make a report, but we only have to share what we know. And we won't make you tell us more than you want to tell us. So if you were to say to us, I saw another kid get assaulted, and I don't know that kid's name, that's all we would have to report. We're not going to follow up with you and say, well, you have to tell us who the kid was. You have to tell us where or when it happened. That's not your role. A mandatory reporting hotline is designed to get somebody whose actual job it is to investigate, but you don't feel like you have to do it. But when you have to make that report, you do want to engage with the person who gave you the information, right? So if it's a survivor told you something, you want to follow those rules of what is a reasonable notice to them that something's going to happen. And if you've got any kind of organizational policy and procedures for how to prepare to make a report, follow those. I think it's a good idea to have those. It's a good idea to talk to your supervisor or your manager and say, can we kind of think about how would we get ready to make the phone call? What are the steps we would go through? When I was managing a law office, and there were a couple times as lawyers that we had to make a report, not for child abuse, but for something different. The lawyers who had the information came to me as their boss, and we sat down and we looked at the law and we made sure we had that correct, and we communicated with the client what the law was going to make us do and safety planned with the client about how to get support and help so that violence wouldn't happen, and then wrote down exactly what the lawyer was going to call and say. And the lawyer made the phone call and read what she had written down and then said, that's all the information I can give you. But she found it very helpful to just have written down in front of her what she was going to say, so she knew that she had thought in advance about the limits, and that what she had there both met her duty but didn't go too far. And then if there were follow-up questions, she was able to say, I've given you everything I'm able to give you. That's all I have to say. Which raises the question of what goes, if you were going to write down what you were going to say, what goes in it? What do I have to report? This goes back to the statute. They are not all the same. It is not if a reportable event happens and you are a reporter, you call and tell everything you know. That's not how this works. You have to know what does the statute actually require you to share, but in my experience, every statute says only what you know, right? Only if you know it. If there is a blank form that is supposed to be filled out, it's not your duty to go back to the survivor and get the survivor to answer every question in that form. That's a kind of investigation, and that's outside of your role. There is a concept in ethics. It's both, we talk about this with the Violence Against Women Act confidentiality. It's also a concept in the National Association of Social Worker Ethics, that when you do have to make a disclosure, you disclose the minimum amount necessary to accomplish the purpose. The minimum amount necessary to accomplish the purpose. And it's only what you know. You're not required to go out and get new stuff. So I've mentioned several times, I'm just going to reiterate one more time, that VAWA requires you make reasonable attempts to notify somebody who's affected, but if the notice increases violence or danger or harm, then it's not something that you should do. And you take reasonable steps to protect the privacy and safety. So one way to center the survivor when you have to make a mandatory report is, first of all, to continue to do advocacy. So the question that I asked earlier and the really nice points that Autumn made about doing safety planning, talking about options, finding out where they're at, what they want. You know, if you've got parenting classes or counselors, you connect them with those people. You're going to continue to do all that advocacy. You can also do advocacy to help the survivor mitigate harm. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes on a future slide. Respecting the survivor's right to know about the report, and then talking to the survivor about how the report gets made. So it may be that a survivor wants to make the report for themselves, and that you can fulfill your mandatory reporter duty by listening to them make the report, and just knowing that the connection was made to child welfare. It may be that you listen to them make the report, but under your law, you need to actually then get on the phone and say, you know, I'm a mandatory reporter, I'm aware of this event, and I'm telling you that, you know, I just heard what she said, and that's everything that I know. In some states, mandatory reporters are allowed to make an anonymous report. So you call in and you say, I'm a mandatory reporter and I'm making a report, but I'm not going to tell you at the hotline who I am, which means that you don't have to worry about them calling you for follow-up calls. It may be that a survivor says, I don't want to make this call, but I want to hear what you say. And so you might let them sit in and listen to the report that you make. And it might be that a survivor says, I don't want to make this report. You know, I'm angry, I don't want anything to do with this, or I'm scared. I just want you to do it and let me know when it's happened. Right? So these are all different ways. And I don't ever, sometimes I hear people say, oh, we encourage survivors to make the report for themselves. I don't think that's best practices. Best practices in advocacy is to tell survivors what's possible and let them choose where their comfort zone is, right? So it's not sort of encouraging or persuading somebody who's really not comfortable talking to child welfare to do it, because it could make the situation worse rather than better. And some of this is about, you know, your knowledge about CPS's attitudes that will help you support survivors through this process. The big question that comes up with advocates, they'll say, I'm a reporter, I made the mandatory report, I thought it was over, but child welfare keeps calling and asking for more information, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do. So certainly the federal confidentiality continues. If you were VAWA-funded confidential before, you continue to be VAWA-funded confidential, which means you generally are not sharing information unless there's a law that requires you to do so. Subpoenas cannot be ignored. If you get a subpoena from a court, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to run down and turn over all the information, but it does mean that you have to do something, and that a subpoena can be challenged in court. And that is something that we give technical assistance on, and sometimes we can help folks find a lawyer to represent your agency to challenge a subpoena. So please be aware of that, and reach out for help if you need it. Typically, under the law, you are not mandated to assist in an ongoing investigation, and you are not mandated to monitor parents. So I've heard stories from shelters, domestic violence shelters, where they'll say, well, child welfare gave the mom and the kid a ride to the shelter, checked her in, and then said to us, call us if she leaves. That's not part of mandatory reporting. That is a child welfare system asking you to monitor somebody, and that's outside. That's not survivor-centered, and it's not an advocate's role. It's not a DV shelter's role. DV shelters are not jails, and they are not involuntary commitment facilities. And so sometimes you may experience child welfare asking you to do things that are not appropriate to your role, and you're going to have to sort of get centered on what you do and what you don't do. This gets back to developing that relationship so that if you, unrelated to an individual case, can talk to child welfare and say, look, you know, I really want to make sure you understand how we work and what we do and what are the things that we don't do, so that when we work together in the future, we don't have frustrations because we both have reasonable expectations of each other. The other thing that a lot of people are not aware of that I like to try to make clear is the stages of how a child welfare might engage with families. And there might be folks on this webinar who have a very good understanding of this or have experience working for child welfare agencies. Some CPS workers will blur the line. They kind of take the attitude, I work for Child Protective Services, I'm good for kids, so anytime I'm involved, I kind of get what I need. And I certainly understand why, you know, that they would feel like that makes their job easier, but it's not necessarily the rule. What I often say to folks is just say to them, if there is a rule that I have to share that information with you, please send me a copy of the rule. But until you can send me a rule, here's a copy of my confidentiality rule, which you would give them. If you're covered by VAWA, you would give them VAWA. If it's FIPSA, if there is a privilege statute, whatever the rule is that you have, just give them a copy. And then say to them, if you have a different rule, please give me a copy of it. The simplest way to break down the stages of child welfare engagement with families is that the first stage is investigation, right? A hotline call, and then somebody comes out to try to investigate and figure out what's going on. And then the sort of middle stage is often a court trying to make a decision whether a parent is actually an unfit parent and whether children should be removed. That's a different stage from the investigation. There's a court's involved. And then a third stage is often that the parent has been determined to be unfit in some way, and now they are doing work, the work that's been asked of them by child welfare to do better and to be able to have their children home with them. And so that work might be counseling. That work might be parenting classes, and they might get sent to work with you in your role as a domestic violence advocate. And that's not the same as the mandatory reporting phase. Like, people should be able to have confidentiality during that phase. If somebody tries to tell you they don't have confidentiality, then you just want to say, can you show me the rule that says that? It's really important to pay attention to that. The other thing I'm just going to mention real quickly, this isn't mandatory reporting, but I'm seeing this come up a lot, is that the folks who work in child welfare, really, they want kids to be home with their families and they want them to be safe. And so they're trying to find a guarantee of safety. And what I'm seeing more and more is courts or child welfare agencies sending individuals to a domestic violence program to be, quote, assessed, as if, and I don't even know for what, because if the question that we're assessing is, has someone else victimized you, we know the answer when the survivor says, someone else has victimized me. I think they're looking for some proof that it's not the victim's fault, or a guarantee that the victim will not be assaulted by someone else again, and we don't have those tools. You know, the only person in control of whether violence happens is the person perpetrating the violence. And we don't even have a good assessment for them. But we really, there is no such thing as a validated, accepted assessment of whether someone will be victimized again by an intimate partner. So if you working in domestic violence advocacy or experiencing child welfare agencies asking you to do those assessments, I really encourage you to communicate with your colleagues in child welfare and explain to them that's not what you do, right? That what you do is you start by believing. If somebody comes into you and says, I'm a survivor, and you say, okay, I believe you, how can I help? And that is the service that you can provide, but telling them, this person is telling the truth or a lie, or this person will or will not be harmed again in the future, it's just not something that's within your capacity to do. And the truth is, it's not within anyone's capacity. Nobody has figured out the answers to those questions. Really, the only person who knows whether an assault will happen is the person who's going to do it. You want to think about, how does your program prepare to engage with child welfare in a way that's appropriate to your role. And I talked a little bit about not agreeing to do assessments when assessments don't exist. You want to consult as much as possible with local attorneys. I know I've talked about that. It's not just a full employment for attorneys program. It really is. There are certain areas of specialty where you need someone who's trained in the specialty. And so tribal law experts and state law experts are important allies to work with to understand the rules that apply to you. And I really advocate that you find them. If you're having a difficulty identifying those folks, reach out to me and I might be able to help you depending on what area of the country you're in. Because I travel around so much and train everywhere, I know somebody in most places, and I may be able to help you connect. Your program wants to have a consistent policy and procedure about how you approach the steps of preparing for and handling a mandatory report. And your program should be having conversations with child welfare in advance about things that you know are going to come up, such as a child is living in shelter and there is a hotline call made. And so Child Protective Services has to interview that child. They have to lay eyes on them, and in some places they're required to assess their living environment. How is that going to get handled inside of a confidential shelter? So having conversations in advance about how you're going to manage that, where everybody's values matter, and you find some kind of a system for addressing what needs to be done without compromising anybody's values or legal duties. It is going to be hard sometimes to make a decision about whether or not a report needs to be made or how it needs to be handled or whether it's reasonably safe to tell somebody. Every mandatory reporting law says that individual people have to make the decision whether to report by themselves. It is ultimately your decision. Your boss can't prohibit you from making a report if you think it's the right thing to do and you're mandated to do it. But at the same time, I think when you're exposed to somebody who you think is being harmed, it's really hard to make a clear-headed decision. And I know that from working in my law office, where we would have to make decisions about when we were going to violate confidentiality and share information against a client's wishes. We never made that decision alone. We had an ethics committee that I was on, and so an attorney would come to the ethics committee and say, I have to make this hard decision, I would like help. And having the help of somebody who has not been the person who was sitting in the room with the survivor can be very helpful. Now, I know this isn't a great suggestion for those of you who are working in what feels like essentially alone, and if you want to try to think about what might be a process where you are for getting support to make hard decisions, please reach out for technical assistance. We'll help you think that through. I often get the question about consent forms. How do we use releases, sometimes called releases or waivers, or consent forms when we're talking about mandatory reporting? So I've had folks say to me, so if I think it's a mandatory report, do I have to go get the survivor to sign a consent form? And here's what I'm going to say to you. Consent forms have no role for mandatory reporting. Because if what you're saying is the law requires me to report this information, then it doesn't matter whether the survivor signs a consent or doesn't sign a consent. The law is the one that's instructing you to share the information, so you have to share it. If it were a situation where it wasn't a mandatory report, say you weren't required to report something, but a survivor said, I want child welfare to know about this, but I don't want to be the one to make the call. I trust you to make the call. that would be a circumstance where you would say, okay, I need you to give me a written set of instructions that you want me to do this. But if it is a mandatory report, don't waste a survivor's time by going them and saying, you have to sign this consent form so I can share information, which I'm going to share no matter what. It makes their consent irrelevant and meaningless, and I think it disempowers them a lot. It disempowers them more than saying to them, there is a rule, it says I have to do this thing. I have to do it whether it's, whether you like it or not, and I have to do it whether I like it or not. But I want to support you for how we can make this the best possible experience or the least bad experience. But trying to say to somebody they have to sign a consent form for something they actually don't have a choice about, I think it's just rude is the word I'm coming up with, but I think I'd like to use something more sophisticated. But that's really what it feels like. It just feels like disdainful of them. And so we shouldn't be doing that. We should only be using releases when it actually is the survivor's choice. Another question that comes up a lot, not specifically mandatory reporting, but remember we talked about the stages of child welfare engagement, and child welfare might be working with a family long after the mandatory report where people are trying to get their kids back and they're coming to you for services. A lot of times there might be a consent form that was signed at the child welfare office that says, the domestic violence advocate can share everything they know about me. And programs often struggle. Like, are we supposed to follow that? What I always say to people is have a conversation with the survivor about it. Let them know about what it actually means, what would actually get shared, find out if that's really what they wanted. If they want to make a different choice, they can rip up that consent form and do a different one or do a narrower one with you. And some survivors will say, I don't like it. I don't like it one little bit, but I'm going to sign this form because these people have my kid, and I'm going to do absolutely anything they ask me to do to get my kid back. So I've signed the form. Please share with them. I think it's important to distinguish between options and choices. Sometimes people have really bad options, narrow, limited, crappy options that they don't like. But within those options, they have to make choices. What you try to do as an advocate is increase options, increase the possibilities. What can you do to help somebody have a better set of options, but then let them make their choices, even if it feels like it wasn't very fair that their options were so narrow. And that's really, what I think about when I get technical assistance calls where people say, we feel like child welfare is forcing her to sign this form. Like, the child welfare system has the ability to be coercive because they have control over children. And we know that parents will often do anything to protect their relationship with their children or protect their children. And so it is a coercive experience. If we are uncomfortable with that, then we want to do the strategic advocacy work of building relationships with child welfare and encouraging child welfare to find ways to build safe, stable families with less coercion involved. Okay, so we have PACT, learning the rules, alerting the survivor, knowing CPS's views, and preparing to talk to CPS. The fifth stage of the plan is empowering the survivor. So that means asking the question, what can you do within the rules? And we already talked about this a little bit. Can you give the survivor the opportunity to make a report for themselves? You are not, unless there is a rule that says differently, but I have not yet seen one. Domestic violence advocates or housing providers are not required to keep survivors within housing just because child welfare asks them to. Even though you might be required to make a report immediately, you still can give a survivor notice and an opportunity to prepare for the consequences of the report. You can think about what are the resources that might be available to the survivor to mitigate harm. And mitigate just means reduce harm, right? Is there anything that's available to make this experience of engaging with child welfare better? Sometimes if somebody is, for instance, they are abusing drugs, and that is going to be a very harmful fact when they engage with child welfare, and it could interfere with their ability to have their children. Is there some place available for them to start getting services or treatment right away? And I know that resources can be terrible in many communities, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't look and try to grow them or be aware of them, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that there sometimes just aren't any, but at least thinking through the question is important. Can we get a lawyer to help survivors? I think much like everyone's entitled to a public defender in U.S. courts, if you're charged with a crime, I think everyone should be entitled to a lawyer when they are dealing with child welfare. We don't have that system, but there may be lawyers in your community who are either free legal services or nonprofit lawyers who are available. It might be possible to get lawyers to do this as a pro bono matter. If you are in any kind of collaborative groups with lawyers or have those relationships, start talking about this, because it makes an enormous difference whether or not you have a lawyer to help you communicate with and negotiate with child welfare when they are investigating your family. Think about what you can do as a systemic strategic advocate. Is there any kind of political pressure on government to get this right? I think the unfortunate truth is that the child welfare system is designed to be confidential because it's trying to protect the privacy of children who have been harmed and are involved with it, and that is a good thing. I come from the Confidentiality Institute. I believe in confidentiality. But the consequence of that confidentiality is I think it is not well understood generally what is happening to people or what they are experiencing, or when there are abuses by the system of individual people or families. It ends up being sort of a secret. And we know that there was a long time that Native families were experiencing abuses by government with children, that it was like an open secret, right? And there wasn't political pressure to fix it. And so if you're seeing something go on in your community, is there a possibility for you as an advocate to build political pressure for child welfare to do better, for government to get this right? There's nothing more important than getting this right, because we don't want to have a system that's designed to prevent harm to children, causing harm to children. And there may be survivors who have engaged with the child welfare system who want to become activists in some way around making sure that the system is getting it right and doing it well. And are you supporting them in their journey to become activists, to become impactful in their community? And if there are attorneys in your area who are working on policy issues and trying to figure out how to make government work well for people and to build safe communities, make sure they know about this issue and they're thinking about whether they want to or can work on it. Okay, that's the bag. You want to keep it packed for a survivor-centered safe trip. Know what your rules are. Know how you're going to alert survivors to your rules. Have a relationship with and an understanding of how Child Protective Services views violence. Know how you're going to prepare to tell Child Protective Services when you have to make a report, and think about what is in your within your reach to empower survivors, either when you're working with individual survivors or when you're working to build your better community. What can you do to make survivors stronger in this interaction with child welfare when we're thinking about, because that's how we build safe and stable families, right? All right, I am confident you have questions. I'm happy to take them right now. If anybody wants to send in a question right now, we have a couple of minutes left to address them. But also, you don't have to, I know it's a little bit public to chat in a question. You can ask a question anytime by sending me an email, alicia@confidentialityinstitute.org. Again, I can't be your lawyer, so when you send me an email, it's not privileged, so I don't ever want any identifying information about any survivors. But I can offer technical assistance, and sometimes I can make a connection with a local lawyer. Or you can look for answers, model forms, templates, answers to frequently asked questions at techsafety.org/resources. There's an entire confidentiality toolkit. There's also a couple of technology toolkits, one for survivors using technology, one for agencies using it, and one for agencies providing digital services to survivors. And that is sponsored by the National Network to End Domestic Violence, which is a major partner for Confidentiality Institute on providing technical assistance to victim service providers working with domestic and sexual violence survivors. But my partner for today was Red Winds Consulting, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to present on this. No one has chatted in a question so far. This is not surprising, as you've been a little bit of a quiet crew, but I really am here and available. If there's something on your mind right now, I will happily address any questions that you have later if you send them to me in an email.
All right, oh, never mind.
Thank you, Adam.
All right, so if no one has any questions, we'll start to wrap up. So, coming up on the 24th of this month, there will be another webinar named Securing Housing Options for Participants, and that'll be Wednesday the 24th, same time. And then after that, we'll be building partnerships with your tribal housing authority, and that'll be next month on the 15th, same time. And on Red Wind's website, we have a forum that you can go to and discuss a variety of different topics with other grantees, and it's facilitated by Red Wind, so questions can be directed there. It's a good place to talk between other organizations if you have any questions or concerns or anything like that. It's really a space to allow all of you to connect with one another and help problem solve anything within your organizations that maybe another organization has dealt with and found a solution to. And that is on Red Wind's website, which is Red Wind Consulting. And I believe that is all. So, thank you, Alicia Lord, our TA host. Thank you, our presenter, Alicia Aiken. And thank you all for joining us. And we hope to see you at the next webinar.